Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's discussion of the Parallax View, a film that I think is just absolutely terrific and is a wonderful example of how a cultural moment or an era in time can influence the content of a film, certainly, but also the style in which it's made. And we are watching this film in part because it was suggested to us by Lisa DeNight, who is joining us, of course. Lisa, how are you?
I'm doing very well, Andrew. How about yourself?
Fine, thanks. Thanks for suggesting the movie and your wonderful introduction as well. For those of you who might be new to our discussions, or if you just might benefit from a reminder, please keep your audio muted until I call on you to make your question or comment. I will know to call on you to make your question or comment because you will use the little raise hand function within Zoom. You can see it marked on the graphic by the number 2. Raise your hand and I will answer or call on people in the order that the hands appear to come up. I will try to get to every single comment or question. If we are running long, people might not get a second chance, but I'll try to get to everybody at least once. We would also encourage you to use the chat function. My colleague Jill is in the chat, and she is keeping an eye on the goings on there and will let us know about any really important hot takes that Lisa and I need to comment on. But it's also a great way for you to chat amongst yourselves or to let us know where you're from if you're joining us from outside the greater Philadelphia area. And if you're joining us from somewhere really far outside the greater Philadelphia area, as some people do, as you can see from the map on your screen, please visit brynmarfilm.org and go to the Where in the World page within Film Studies Online and let us know a bit about how you found us and how you think we're doing and where you're from. We'd love to know. It's one of the silver linings to doing everything remotely is that people can join from all over, and it's really been great for us. But that's about it for the ground rules. So until what was I going to say? I don't remember what I was going to say. Okay, so I think we are ready to get started, and I will say that it is no surprise that we have David starting us off. David, how are you tonight?
Good evening. Yes, it's no surprise, and that's Janice's picture, not mine. Lisa, this is either a really great time or a really awful time to have us watching and thinking about conspiracy movies in today's world. I'm not trying to be political, but rather the fact that conspiracy has sort of become an almost a norm. It made me think of some of the conspiracy movies that I've watched over the years. I made a quick list, which you probably could expand on. 7 Days in May, 3 Days of the Condor, Wag the Dog, both Manchurian Candidates, Blowout, which we saw together a month or 3 ago, and All the President's Men. I'd like you to mention, if you can, a little bit about the location shoots here. There seemed to be an awful lot of outdoor shooting. I guess that's one of Pakula's hallmarks, I'm not sure. And one of the things that Janice and I noticed on the so-called monolithic background of the Parallax Corporation was it reminded both of us right away of the Sydney Opera House look. I think that some of these action shots and the idea of going back and forth between these theories of conspiracy sort of made my head spin a little bit. I was wondering whether I had whiplash at the end. A lot for discussion. Hopefully I'm leading you off to one or two good things. And thank you again for expanding my knowledge base in movies.
Well, thanks for that, David. I too was struck. I've seen this movie a number of times, but I too was struck by some of the location filming, particularly the scene toward the beginning that takes place at and seemingly on top of the Space Needle. Lisa, I know that you part of the reason we're watching this film, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think part of the reason we're watching this film now instead of at a different point in this series of discussions is because a new Criterion version came out. And I wonder if maybe you had any info on locations from the goodies that come with one of those?
Well, I don't remember anything specific about the on-location shooting, except for something that I referred to in my introduction. There is a great essay that came out with the new Criterion edition that was released a couple weeks ago by Nathan Heller, who writes about the cold corporate office building that the Parallax Corporation is an office tenant in, and it was just a really compelling reorienting of the history of that sort of office building. This kind of brand new at the time in this late 60s, early 70s part of the 20th century, where big office towers were going up entirely encased in mirrored glass, and how resonant of a choice, how purposeful of a choice that was by Pakula to set his, shadowy corporation in one of these buildings. And that really resonated with me. It was just a great comment and insight overall. The choice to shoot on some of these locations, like the Space Needle, I thought was really incisive, especially when you consider the very opening shot of the film is a totem pole that had been at the place where they found it. It was a centuries old totem pole in Seattle. And that wonderful opening shot where your perspective changes from a totemic construction of a culture that Americans raced to shifting to this totemic emblem of American culture, a tourist bit of a sightseeing adventure in Seattle. It was just a great way to open this picture. And the on-location shooting is just so interesting throughout. I love the on-location shooting with the dam, Gorge Dam, and Salmon Tail, just another instance of a monolith kind of representing evil. It's very simplistic, but yeah, the on-location shooting was fabulously resonant, and I'm glad that appealed to you, David.
I think that I'm so glad you mentioned that opening shot, Lisa, because the way you start out and you can't see the Space Needle initially. You see just the totem pole, and then the perspective changes and you see the Space Needle looming over it. And, everyone will tell you that the way to, give a speech or, have a good spot on a talk show or tell a good story or make a good movie is to tell people what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. And this movie does that, and it does it the way a movie's supposed to, which is visually with that opening shot. If you want to talk about the sense of, as Lisa said, a sort of an all-powerful monolith, if you want to talk about the raw power of commerce and industry that can and has, and in this movie does, stamp out any sort of resistance to it. If you want to talk about the emergence of certain types of technology and how that gives power to those who have it and leaves those who don't at a disadvantage, that shot suggests all of these many themes that you could tease out of the movie. And to tell us what we're going to, just tell us in a nutshell the story we're going to see. But to do it visually without any dialogue and without even any animate objects was just was really smart filmmaking and I think really effective. The other thing I will say is I am still struck every time I see this movie by the scene on top of the Space Needle. That is not green screen. That is not done in a studio. the bad thing and the good thing about 1974 in Hollywood is that you can tell when something is an effect shot. And if that movie were made today, I wouldn't feel confident saying one way or the other. In fact, well, I would say it looked real, but I would be almost sure it wasn't. But in this case, it looks real and it has to be real. And that is amazing. I'm sure Alfred Hitchcock was, when he saw that, was thinking, why couldn't I do that on the Statue of Liberty or Mount Rushmore or any of the other places he had to pretend to stage something?
I will say, just to add on to that, yes, that was real. That man did tumble off the edge of the Space Needle. And they described, the crew describes this in an interview I read. He didn't have far to fall. The balcony that we saw was just below him. But I agree, it is sort of terrifying to watch that tumble over the Space Needle. It's impressive. Yeah, I don't think that would have been done today, Andrew. I think you're right.
Oh, and it looks like Vicky in the chat has mentioned that it looks very different today. Much like, actually, if you look at the top of any tall building from the 60s or 70s, or in the case of something like An Affair to Remember, the 30s or 40s, it's very different levels of security and barriers than there are nowadays. So that's a good point. They probably couldn't have done that today. But wow, that was really something. Richard, you have a question or comment?
One of each, if I might.
Sure.
I agree that the cinematography was incredible, that Warren Beatty did a good job in acting. The scenes on the Space Needle, I also thought in the auditorium with the ambulance were, brilliant. Except I'm reminded of the statue of Noah in Piazza Signoria in Italy, where when that statue was there, Michelangelo and others looked at it and said, what a waste of a beautiful piece of marble. I mean, I think the stuff that was done here is beautiful, but overall, I don't think the movie was very good. And my question is kind of relating to what we're doing here. Is this particularly a course in talking so we would learn about history of movies and techniques of movies and techniques of cinematography? Or are we supposed to just be viewers and look at a movie and say why we like it or not?
Well, Richard, this isn't a course. It's a discussion series, and that means that people are supposed to bring, as you have, their ideas, their opinions, and their questions. And hopefully I, who's here every week, and my co-moderator, in this case, Lisa, will be able to give some sort of informed response to those questions. And perhaps people's perspectives and ideas about the movies and maybe other things will be influenced by listening to what their fellow attendees have to say. This is not really a forum where we can talk in any specifics or detail about cinematography. And frankly, that is a very important aspect of movies. And it's one that we certainly do like to talk about, but it's not the only one. And it's not the only way that people engage with movies. So my hope would be that people would not, I don't think we're asking, and I don't think people are saying what they like and don't like. At least they're not stopping there. They may start there, and that's a perfectly valid way to start. But we hope people would, as I would ask you to, you'd said that you thought that there were certain formal elements, certain aesthetic choices that stood out to you, but overall you didn't think the movie was very good. I guess I would say, that's kind of like saying that you didn't like it. I would say, can you go a bit deeper and talk about some of the reasons why you didn't like it? And that might lead all of us to a more sort of constructive discussion that I think you're looking for.
Well, if I had to do it, I'd say I thought the plot was really totally unbelievable and ridiculous. It just didn't have any sense of what happened as well. And therefore, it doesn't really get to the deeper meaning that they're trying to convey.
Okay. I mean, I guess everybody may think, I guess I would have two responses to that. One is, I don't know that everybody would say they found the plot entirely ridiculous. You may have some knowledge of or experience in some field that makes, you know, I don't know, law enforcement or some, maybe a historian who studied certain, you know,
I haven't
assassinations.
assassinated anybody.
I wasn't suggesting that you had, but perhaps you have some perspective that allows you to have a bit more of a point of comparison for quote unquote reality. I know, for example, lawyers have trouble watching legal shows, doctors have trouble watching, you know, medical shows. The other thing I would say is, I don't know that, I mean, we're not here to talk about the feasibility of movies per se. I mean, that's a valid point in terms of whether you like it or not, but that only gets us so far, right? I mean, there's lots of movies that we all see and that we all enjoy and that many of us would say are very good, that we don't, frankly, don't find, wouldn't say seemed very quote unquote credible. And I have to say that I don't particularly agree with you in this case. I mean, do I think that there's a corporation that exists solely to commit political assassinations? No, I don't. Do I think that the way the company, the Parallax company operates is an interesting lens through which to think about how such events occur and how such people come to do these terrible things? I do think that's interesting. You know,
I don't have a problem with that. I mean, that doesn't give me any problem.
Good.
You know, I don't need reality, but there's a difference between deviating from reality and silliness. And I didn't think that this one came close enough to bring you into it. I mean, yeah, a lot of the movies that we see have, you know, unrealistic things, but kind of not soup to nuts.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks very much for your sharing your thoughts and your questions. Lisa, did you have any thoughts on what Richard was saying?
I will simply say, because Richard, I don't think that you are alone. Certainly in 1974, it was received with mixed reviews at best. I think someone pointed out in the chat, like Vincent Canby certainly didn't like it. It has always received mixed reviews with audiences and critics. But for me, why I chose this and why I kind of want to push back at the idea of the plot being silly is that I would like to kind of position, for purposes of this conversation, or at least for everyone to kind of think about, that I approach this film as less a perfect, you know, traditional narrative that is satisfying in its narrative scope. I approach it as a perfect thematic manifesto where every aspect of the cinematic process, every aspect of the making of this film is aligned and codifying paranoia and distrust into the very texture of the film, like from every part of it. So honestly, the silliness, the unevenness of the plot, to me, fits in very well. Like I don't fully understand everything that happens in the Parallax View, and I have seen this film so many times. Like the parrot scene in the very beginning when Warren Beatty is walking into someone's house, it's like, oh, my parrot's on there, and then the police show up. Like, I don't know what's going on, and I've seen that scene a bunch. But the unevenness, the unknowability of so much of this film, to me, is what makes me more receptive to the message of the Parallax View. Like, not understanding everything about the Parallax View, to me, is central in accepting the thematic message of the Parallax View. And I understand that that's not going to fly with everyone, but that's how I approach it. So I would just hope that people approach this film and not trying to connect every one of the dots, but rather kind of given more to the thematic propulsion and deeply cynical worldview of this film.
I mean, to me, that's really one of the amazing things about this is in an era, you know, the first half of the 1970s filled with actually all of the 1970s filled with extremely cynical movies about government corruption and the hollowness of the American dream and the horrors of unchecked capitalism, et cetera, et cetera. This arguably might be the most cynical. And I was saying this to Lisa before the discussion started, and I would ask all of you to think about it. It's really not until sometime in the 1960s when a Hollywood protagonist doesn't achieve everything he sets out to achieve in a Hollywood movie, right? It's by the late 1960s, they either can fail or we can start to sort of have the bad guy perhaps be the protagonist, but ultimately they still have to be punished. This movie doesn't only have the protagonist not succeed in what he's trying to do. It has the protagonist become the perpetrator of the exact thing he is trying to stop. And that is a level of cynicism that was put out by a major Hollywood studio starring one of the biggest stars at the time with all the bells and whistles of a Hollywood movie, the cinematographer from The Godfather, et cetera, et cetera. And that was put out as a major motion picture by a studio. To me, that says something really significant about where the industry was and about where the country was, that they thought that this was something they were ready for. And as Lisa said, and as some of you were saying, obviously not everybody was ready for it. But the boldness of that expression, I think alone makes the movie worth considering. Let's see. Robert, you have a question or comment.
Well, thanks. I thought I kind of agree with Vincent Canby. I just feel like this kind of genre where you have sort of an innocent kind of, somebody said in this chat, like a scruffy guy, you know, some innocent fellow who gets involved in some horrible crime and they take it upon themselves to investigate it and get to the bottom of it because they are afraid or they refuse to call the police. And there's a few films like that, like, for example, Blue Velvet, to me is the master film in this genre, or even Days of the Condor, or somebody else had mentioned something else like Chinatown. I just felt this was not up to those films. I think it's partly because I don't know how other people felt, but I thought Warren Beatty was just a pretty face. I mean, there's no acting involved. I didn't think there was any acting involved in this film particularly. And I just think somebody like Harrison Ford should have played this part. I mean, I just didn't think that Beatty had the gravitas, you know, to pull this off. He was just a pretty face and kind of like did what he did. And I felt like there were some echoes of other films. And I just wanted to hear what you guys think. Like, for example, the scene on top of the needle. That reminded me of the scene on top of the four presidents in the national park in North by Northwest, where they're struggling and on top of a.
I'm going to stop you right there, Robert. I mean, good guys and bad guys fighting in a dangerous, famous location is something that is so ubiquitous that I don't think we can. You can call it cliche if you want, but I don't think you can say it was borrowed from this movie or that movie. It's like saying, you know, a cop movie with a foot chase, you know, it's just part of the genre. So I think you can say it's cliche, or you can say that you've seen it before. I think that's entirely fair, but I don't know that it's it's gonna really, because we could name so many movies where that occurs. I mean, Hitchcock himself probably has 5 or 6 that we could all think of.
Oh, okay. The other thing that reminded me was the guy was going to assassinate the senator at the end during a concert where people were singing. And that just brought back to me echoes of Hitchcock's, that famous scene where somebody's going to, I think it's called The Man Who Knew Too Much, where they're going to kill somebody right when the drums, when they make a certain
Right.
sound. And that just reminded me of it. And then it also brought to mind Altman's Nashville, which also ends on an assassination on the 4th of July. Anyway.
Well, thanks, Robert. This was based on a novel. I don't know how closely the plot hews to it. I will say that I don't think it's exactly the same as the second Hitchcock reference, because this is going to be a political rally of some sort. It's true there. I think the band was going to play or something, but I think it was primarily a political rally. But to your first point about Warren Beatty, I think that's a very interesting point, because I've never been I think he's a great movie star. I don't know that he's a great actor, and
Yes.
people disagree with me. Roger Ebert in his review disagreed with me. Roger Ebert but he thought this part wasn't worthy of Beatty.
Right.
My response to that is that I think, now I may be giving Pakula too much credit, I may be giving Beatty too much credit here, but I think part of the point is the naivete and hubris of his character, right? And you get some of that from Hume Cronin, who supports him and tries to help him. But for the first, act of the movie, doesn't say, but sort of says with his face, you're really going to do this? You really want to try to take this on? So I think it's possible that your opinion of Warren Beatty, that he's the same guy from Shampoo, even though I think that was a year later, and all those other movies where he plays a Lothario or whatever, or from the real world where he played a Lothario, certainly through the 70s. I think that may have been somewhat intentional. I don't know that for certain. And as I said, I don't know that Beatty was aware of that, but I wouldn't be surprised if Pakula was aware of that.
Well, I am going to say that I think maybe everyone's selling Beatty a little bit short. I think that, and I'm not a Beatty completist by any means, but I think that a lot of his best roles, he is kind of consciously playing on this meta status of his larger than life kind of singular charismatic persona. And I know that this movie was kind of hinging on Warren Beatty, because there was, I think I alluded to in my intro, a lot of fraught tension around whether or not this could be made with a script, because it was butting up against a writer's strike in Hollywood, and Beatty was essentially like pay or play. So I mean, it needed to be made with Beatty per Pakula. Pakula was not going to take anyone else. So they kind of rush forward with difficulties in the script department, I'll say, just to make sure that they kept Beatty in the film. And I agree with Andrew. I think this film is purposefully trading on the persona of this bad boy, beauty, singular, charismatic persona, in making this character seem like he's gonna win, or he's gonna get to the bottom of the conspiracy, while all the while we see this great disconnect between how Frady sees himself and who Frady actually is. Like, Frady is at some, I don't know, 4th bit newspaper in Oregon, and he thinks that he's gonna, crack the case and get the Pulitzer. And as Andrew said, like, Hume Cronin is like, you really? You? And I think using Warren Beatty in this film is so smart, because it makes the tragedy of Hollywood heroes absolute utter failure, like being co-opted against himself, makes it all the more powerful and stinging and just so depressing. So I think it was very purposeful that Bakula used Beatty, and I also think that Beatty did a great job in the role. Like he's playing a renegade reporter who's then playing a violence malcontent, and he plays the role just well enough that he gets in the door, but not well enough to
Right.
stymie
To
the
ace things when he
Parallax
gets in there.
Corporation. Yeah.
Right.
So I thought he was really good in the role, and much more than a pretty face, even though the film is trading on that pretty face to make it effective.
Mhm.
I think he does a great job if he is supposed to, if we are supposed to perceive that his character does not do a great job at everything. And if that's the case, and I think there's, good reason to think that is the case, then he does a perfect job, I think, for the part. He's not, doesn't seem all that convincing, but I mean, think about it. He fails at convincing the people he needs to convince, which is why he's always in so much trouble. So in that sense, it kind of works. Thanks, Robert.
Thank you.
Joss, do you have a question or comment?
Sure. I enjoyed this movie when I first saw it, when it first came out, and I just kind of let it roll over me and not worry too much about the huge holes in the plot and the inconsistencies. But I do recognize that those holes are there. I want to get back to something that came up earlier when, at the beginning, David mentioned the entire genre, the genre of paranoid thriller, and referenced a whole wonderful list of movies, which is something I was going to do, but he's already done it. But I want to get back to that and see if you have any comments, particularly about a couple of movies that came out 10 or so years before this. One, The Manchurian Candidate, which was also satirical, and the other, 7 Days in May, also both based on novels. Another thing I wanted to point out, I think Beatty was a producer of this film. I don't know what influence that had. And finally, some of the elements of the filmmaking, and two in particular, and Lisa, you mentioned this in your intro, the incredible cinematography. And the other one is the music. And hearing the music in this, I said, oh my God, it's the same music from All the President's Men, and other Pacula film. It must be the same composer, and it's not. It's a different composer. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that style of music for this type of movie. Okay, that was a lot of stuff, so pick whatever you like.
Thanks. Thanks, Joss. Lisa, did anything jump out at you that you wanted to pick up on from what Joss put out there?
Yeah, I'm going to slyly evade the question about the two 60s films, because I haven't seen either in so long. I don't know how relevant I'll be on that. But the score, I am so glad that you commented on the score, because it's one of my favorite film scores. It was by Michael Small, who also did the score for Clute, which 2 out of 3 ain't bad, at least. Of the Paranoia trilogy, I should say. The score to me is just one of all of the cinematic elements that is just in perfect harmony with this deeply cynical, nihilistic worldview. The score, I'm not super fluent in talking about music, but it kind of sounds like there are two different themes kind of playing. And so there are these two different registers where one is quite patriotic. It sounds a little bit like a national anthem of, maybe of this country. It certainly has a lot of that kind of national anthemic quality. But then there's another undercutting tone to the score, the bum 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 bum, and then the piercing little, high-pitched elements throughout. And it's so great at puncturing the patriotism of this really stately part of the score, and also kind of sonically referencing this bifurcation of light and dark of Warren Beatty's character himself. Like there's a real dissonance in those kind of two tones of the score that is just so resonant throughout every single other part of the film. And the last thing on the score I'll say, can't believe we haven't talked about the test montage yet, but the score in the montage is just spectacular. The way that it goes from this very stately patriotic tune to almost like acid rock by the end. It's just so well put together on a sonic level. So I'm very glad that you brought up the score and I got to say a couple words on it. And Andrew, I'll pass it back to you for anything else you want to grab out of that.
I think that was really instructive, and I think we got a lot of people lined up, so I might just go on to the next questioner or commenter. Apologies, Joss, if you want further info on anything you asked about, please shoot me an email. Ken, you have a question or comment? Kenneth.
Yes.
Go ahead, please.
I hadn't raised my hand. But we were talking about that montage. The obvious one that it made me think of was a Clockwork Orange.
Yes.
They did a similar thing. The Clockwork Orange one, to me, was obviously a little more simplified in what they did, but the whole concept was very interesting. And maybe it's a detail, but I missed out on it. I wanted to hear some evaluation that after, they probably read his reactions to seeing all these scenes. I would have liked to see some discussion with him about what the impressions or what they expected of him.
Yeah, I sort of see what you're saying, Ken, that they sort of had this huge sort of centerpiece in the movie, this thing that obviously they spent a lot of, the Parallax company corporation spent a lot of time putting together and thought was prominent because they had that big room dedicated to it. And then we don't really hear they don't seem to do anything with it. I will say that I think the broad concept of this is obviously very similar to Clockwork Orange, but I think the purposes are very different. In a Clockwork Orange, they're sort of trying to give him like aversion therapy for violence. They're trying to
training him rather than analyzing him. Right.
And well, in Clockwork, they're trying to condition him to not be violent anymore. And that's not what they're doing in Parallax, but it's not entirely clear what they're doing in Parallax, except I think they're clearly trying to sort of shift his perspective, right? Or to affirm the shift in perspective they think he's already had based on how he filled out that questionnaire or how he had that murderer fill out that questionnaire.
Right. I thought they were trying to analyze by seeing how he reacted to these different things, whether he would make a good assassin, whether these scenes either upset him or interested him or got him excited, might determine how well he'd work out with them. And I agree. I thought it was a great scene. I really enjoyed how they played it all.
Right. No, I agree. I agree with you. It's not clear what that exists for, and it's so funny because normally that's the sort of thing that would kind of bother me. But I was just so struck by watching how they changed the editing for each of those categories and how they're basically trying to force him and therefore us to make associations that they start out with, I think it's probably fair to say, associations that in the first round of categories that are fairly natural and can be assumed to be held by many people. And they move those basically through editing, right? It's a lesson in filmmaking. That whole sequence is basically a demonstration or an implementation of a theory on film editing put forth by a Russian theorist and filmmaker named Lev Kuleshov, which is basically, and I think it's been borne out over the 100 years since he did his experiments, basically that absent any other sort of instruction, direction, anything like that, when people see a series of shots, film shots, they are going to attribute cause and effect and relationships between them that may or may not, that are not necessarily present in any of those shots. Kuleshov's experiment was, he had an actor come in and he filmed the actor with what he asked the actor to have was a blank expression on his face. And then he edited that same shot of that same actor with that same blank expression. He edited that together with shots of different things. Like he showed a shot of a gun and that shot of the actor. And then he showed a shot of a baby crying and a shot of the actor. And then he showed a shot of a steak and a shot of the actor. And when he showed that to the people, he showed that to volunteers in his research, they said that the man's face showed that the man looked scared in the shot that came after the gun. The man looked hungry in the shot that came after the steak. The man looked annoyed in the shot that came after the baby crying, but they were all the same shot. And that said to Kuleshov that, and I think it's true, that as people, we are always looking for cause and effect and narrative and connections and logic and rationale. And that big sequence is predicated on that being the case, and the Parallax Corporation is trying to use that very strong human tendency to, as you say, either assess the worldview of this person or shift the worldview of this person. Thanks, Ken. Matt, you have a question or comment? Okay. Dana, you have a question?
I'm sorry, I was muted.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
There. Yeah, first I want to thank Lisa for her video introduction, which I watched, and she introduced me to the whole notion of this trilogy of films by this same director, and I had never seen Clute, so I watched that over the weekend as well. And interestingly, the first time I ever saw Parallax View was only just several months ago. So I thought, oh, I've got to watch the film again. But I have to say, when I watched it the second time in a very short while, I found it compelling the first time, and I found it equally compelling the second time, even though I had just seen it. And as I was thinking about it and comparing it to Clute, I realized why. The movie, there's a really enigmatic element to the movie, and some people have been making comments about it in the comment box, that we never learn why the Parallax Corporation is doing what it does. We never learn. Somebody said we can assume they were being paid for this. I also assume that. We never learned who was paying them, what the motivation was, who they were acting for, whatever. The whole stream of assassinations and murders in the movie is just a complete enigma. And then in contrast to Clute, where initially the villain in the movie is unknown, and then gradually you get enough information to figure out who it was. And then at the end of movie of Clue, you know exactly who was perpetrating the murders and why, and he turned out to be completely insane, and so forth. But the similarity in these two movies, and I'll throw in another movie, Alien, which is a completely different genre. The similarity of all three of these movies is there's somebody, or in the case of Alien, a monster, but there's somebody doing some really bad stuff. And you never really, in all three movies, you never really know who is behind it all or why. And, you know, in the case of the alien, it's just because it's this reptilian monster and that's what monsters do. But in these other two movies, you never really find out. And especially in this movie, even till the very end, you never know what Parallax is up to. And so the second time around that I saw this movie, it was, to me, equally mysterious. So I'll leave it there and let others respond.
Well, thanks for that, Matt. Lisa, I hope you don't mind. I'm going to jump in. I have some thoughts on this. First, I'm really glad you brought up Alien, because David Giler, who is one of the screenwriters of this film, was a writer-producer on pretty much all of the Alien movies. He was either a producer or he wrote the screenplay or created the story for most of the movies in that trilogy, including the more recent ones. He at least gets producer credit on Prometheus and the more recent ones, but don't hold that against him. And I think if you remember those movies, lurking in the background, and sometimes not so much in the background of those movies, is the evil corporation, right? Weyland-Yutani, I think it's called, that is, you know, no matter how many times, you know, their plans don't work out, and no matter how many times it wreaks tremendous havoc, they are still determined to try to, you know, capture and weaponize and use for their own purposes this, you know, this monster. And so I think we see some, you know, I think we see some similarity there about, but, you know, with the Parallax Corporation and its view of the sort of evils of capitalism or unchecked corporatism or whatever you want to call it. I would say to you that, you know, the movie says in the beginning, I think it's Warren Beatty, when Paula Prentice first comes to see him, and she basically sort of says to him, I'm in trouble. You thought this was fishy 2 years ago or whenever it all happened. You don't think it's fishy now. What's wrong with you? And he says something like, you know, of course I thought it was fishy. You got to admit, it seemed like every time there was a decent guy who wanted to do something good for the country, he got killed. And of course, he's not just talking about the senator in this movie. He's talking about, you know, the Kennedys, and he's talking about Martin Luther King, and maybe he's talking about Malcolm X. And so my whole thing is that if you appreciate a movie like JFK, which I think is fantasy, but extremely compelling and well-made fantasy, then what allows one to appreciate that movie is the belief that there are people who are determined and it is in their interest to maintain the status quo. And that movie doesn't tell us who it is, and the Parallax View doesn't tell us who it is. But the idea that there's some corporation that exists, that if I have enough money, and obviously I'm cynical and demented and evil enough, I can hire to ensure the status quo, you know, stays in place, you know, that's the very stuff of conspiracies. And there's, you know, I think that a movie that doesn't necessarily justify or explain or rationalize the opposition to, or the villain, or whatever you want to call it, that can be challenging. I will admit that. We want that sort of logic and narrative cohesion. I completely grant you that. I tend to want that in my movies too. The problem is, what if you're making a movie about a world where events happen that don't make any sense? Because your only two choices one's only two choices when looking at the political assassinations of the 1960s is to believe that each of these things was completely unrelated and was perpetrated individually by the people that we know historically to have done them, or to believe that there's some puppet master corporation pulling the strings and facilitating all of these things happen for the highest bidder or highest bidders. I don't really like either of those options, but they both kind of seem equally implausible to me. I happen to believe one of them is the truth. That's the first one, that all those horrible things happen on their own through a series of unbelievable circumstances and the wrong individual being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But neither of those is particularly sort of narratively credible or compelling. But that's what this movie's interested in dealing with. Lisa, did you have anything to add now that I stepped down off my soapbox?
I too love the fact that this Parallax Corporation, that the conspiracy overall just remains an absolute enigma, and a kind of free-floating enigma. Like everything is unknown, everything is a conspiracy. There are a couple things that are kind of at play here, and I'm glad that you brought up the connection to Clute, because the villain of Clute was a businessman, and I think that Clute and the Parallax View share something in common that All the President's Men does not. All the President's Men has a very specific conspiracy that was solved. Very sorry if you guys hear the noise. Someone is shoveling the sidewalk right outside my door. So there's a specific conspiracy that is pinpointed and then triumphantly solved in All the President's Men. Whereas in the Parallax View, it's not a political thriller per se. It's not a political conspiracy. The film isn't interested in the mystery of the senators killing and then all of the witnesses turning up dead. It's way more interested in the insidious and all-pervasive corporatization of the country. That is the evil. That is the conspiracy. But it's also free-floating because the government is giving, perhaps ignorant official cover to the corporatization of America and the criminality that's going on in the Parallax View and any other number of corporations. And I think that the film is so much stronger for me personally by not giving us the kind of political leanings of the people that are hiring the killings of senators left or right. And I also want to insert that I think there's a case to be made in the Parallax View that the Parallax Corporation itself is also killing off people to kind of further this atmosphere, this kind of societal atmosphere of chaos and darkness and uncertainty. If some senator goes bump in the night, then it creates an atmosphere where corporations like the Parallax Corporation can then get paid for their services. The complete instability of what it is they're doing is leading to more business for them, essentially. And then the final thing I'll say is kind of on the topic of conspiracy theories, just in general. I really like that this film doesn't give us the bow-tied, bow-tied and knot edition of who's in charge of the conspiracy, because it gives the film the opportunity to kind of explore the topic of the conspiracy theory and how it feeds on people trying to unravel it with little to no factual information or incomplete information. And so I think it's, someone mentioned earlier about how this was maybe David, it was a very timely moment to be watching a conspiracy film in this current era. And again, we do not want to have a political conversation, but I think that this film does something really resonant for today in kind of dissecting what makes a conspiracy thriller or a conspiracy theory live and grow, and that is people trying to unravel it. Now, should people try to unravel it? Sure, but it's very challenging, and I love the kind of all-encompassing nature of the conspiracy and the parallax view, and how we will never know who's behind it or why.
I will say, I think people who find the movie to be a little bit light on sort of substance in terms of ideology or meaning or whatever, I think that's a fair point. My only rebuttal to that, as that being a criticism, is to say, imagine how awful the movie would be if it swung too much in the other direction. You kind of can't give a little bit of the rationale to something like this, I don't think, because it's sort of like saying, here, you know, only pull for 1 second on this thread, you know, of the sweater, and you're not going to stop. You're going to want to keep pulling and see when it ends. And that's what would happen with this movie. My guess is that it was sort of an all or nothing choice for them, right? Either we have to explain absolutely everything about who the Parallax View is and who Parallax Corporation is and who's paying them and blah, 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 or we can explain none of it because most of this stuff is not comprehended by people anyway. And, you know, they made a choice, and that's the movie we have. Dana, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I do. I don't know if I'll do this very well. I want to stick with pulling the thread, the image that you just created for us. The most interesting thing about this movie is this discussion. And this discussion tonight is really different from, I think, many of the others that we've had. And I wasn't really planning on saying anything, but I'm just so interested in how people are so almost angry about this movie. I mean, maybe that's a strong word, but it's approaching that. And I'm trying to figure out why. And it sort of seems like Lisa's is defending like crazy. You're sort of, Andrew, like defending too, and people are fighting. And I'm trying to figure it out. And I think there's something very interesting going on here. This is a very 70s movie, very, very 70s, beginning with Warren Beatty's hair, which you really can't get past. I mean, it was just the fixture. He's the fixture of the look of the time. That's just the handsome look of a guy. And it's really hard to get away from it. It's hard to see that hair in 2021. So given that, and given all of these themes and everything that's happening in this movie coming out of the 60s and all of the many things that you're saying, I think there's a real difficulty for a 20s audience to watch this film and feel okay with it. I think I think the naivete perhaps that we talked about, the hubris, the fact that we don't really know the bottom of the parallax intention, who they are. I think that's something that's really unsettling for an audience today, in a different kind of way than it was unsettling in the 70s. And I'm getting a sense from the people who are talking about this film, this is really very interesting to me, that they're not willing to accept what this movie is trying to do because we can't. Maybe because you better give us the villain. We need to know a villain. We know so much about these kinds of things. You've got to give it to us. You can't play this game. You could do it in the 70s. You could do this and have it be effective. But right now, I think we're on such icy ground with this sort of thing that this is cutting too close to home. And to have the answer be just a naive guy who fails in the end is unacceptable. And it's because of that, maybe, that a lot of people aren't really able to embrace this film at all, including me. I mean, I'm putting myself sort of in the same place. To me, it doesn't come close to Clute or to All the President's Men, but it does do something. And it does do something that's very special about the 70s that is just not working right now. And I'll just close by saying, I just think the discussion is so fascinating because of the way people are perceiving this movie. So it's kind of, I guess what I'm asking you to talk about is maybe perceptions, how perceptions change when a movie is made. We've talked about this so many times before, and when you watch it many years later, and how it can completely, I don't know, go upside down. So.
Thanks, Dana. Lisa, I've done a ton of talking tonight, so I feel like I should give you first crack to respond to Dana's thoughtful comments.
Dana, thoughtful is underlined by me. Thank you for sharing those comments and for being willing to rope yourself into the pool of people you're talking about. And I did have an inkling when I chose this one that it would not be entirely well liked, because it is just so deeply, bottomlessly, nihilistically cynical. It really is. And while I embrace that, I embrace that honesty and just total tonal worldview in every single aspect of the cinematic product. It is just a totality of vision, and that vision is deeply cynical. So I did have an inkling that it would not be extremely well received, especially in this moment, but I still wanted to show it because it is so honest, and it does. Thank you so much for saying that so eloquently, because it does, either consciously or subconsciously, very consciously in your respect, make you, it elicits a reaction in you. And I want to kind of go back to the training video, or the test video, because what makes that sequence one of my all-time favorite sequences of all cinematic history, I've watched it so many times I should probably be on some FBI watch list, is that it does not cut away to Frady. It doesn't give you what Frady's readings were. It's doing the same test to you, the viewer. It's doing the same test to me. It's doing the same test to us all. It's just, it takes us entirely out of the film's narrative and just shows us something really upsetting and confusing. And I kind of see that as a microcosm of the entire film. Andrew talked very eloquently about how the Kuleshov effect, every single shot changes in the context of what shot came before. And that microcosm of this testing video is just kind of applied to the entirety of the parallax view. And so therefore the feelings of like ickiness or like, oh, what's going on, or just all the bad feelings that you could feel during that training video are transposed on the entire movie, because you're presented with familiar filmic scenarios, but there's just something off about them, or it's something off about what came before, like where they are in context in the story versus where you are in context of the story. So the whole thing is unsettling. The training video is unsettling. The whole movie is unsettling, and man, do I love it for that unsettling nature. And it is provoking quite an interesting conversation. But thank you for your thoughts. That's all I have to say, Andrew. I'll pass it back to you now.
Yeah, I just think that, Dana said what, brought up what I always say, which is that, one of the wonderful things about a movie, and something it's almost cruel in how difficult it is for us to recapture, is when a film is such a specific result or product of its era, of its moment. And I said that at the beginning, and I think it applies to this movie, to such a greater degree than it does to most that we looked at in this series. And I think that I was not of movie-going age when this movie came out, and I was not sentient when certainly when either Kennedy was assassinated, or Martin Luther King was assassinated, or Malcolm X was assassinated, or the Pentagon Papers came out, or when this year, 1974, when Watergate is breaking and Nixon resigns in August of 1974, I believe. And think about all of the things that happened over the preceding 10 or 11 years to shake the foundations of post-World War II American society and think about the icons of authority and stability and respect that were being and had been undermined over this time. To think about that level of uncertainty, that level of instability, that level of the world having a lack of cohesion, the country having a lack of cohesive reason or rationale to it, and then this movie comes out. I think it's the perfect movie for its moment. Now, does that mean it is a really big challenge to those of us who don't think about that context when watching it? It does, but there's an extent to which all movies present that. But perhaps this movie, creates a taller order in that regard. But I think that it's essential, and I think that, as I said before, this movie has many elements to it that I don't typically like. Among people in my in my academic and professional background, I tend to like movies that are neater and more conventional. And Lisa and I were having a talk about a filmmaker before we started that she loves and I do not care for much at all, precisely because that filmmaker is not neat and is very, I would say, sloppy, others would say free in his filmmaking. And this movie, for a Hollywood film of any era, breaks a lot of rules and has a lot of looseness to it, and a lot of, you could say, mystery or uncertainty or, emptiness to it, if you wanted to be really sort of critical or cynical about the movie. But I think that's part of what makes it so interesting, a movie to look at and to think about, and that's why I agree with Lisa that it's something worth seeing and worth discussing. William, you have a question or comment?
Yes, hi. Thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thanks, great. Thanks for taking my question. I have a few comments and a question. And let me first just say I thank you for picking this movie. It makes me feel so ignorant, and it sounds weird because I've just only been getting into learning more about movies in the past few years, even though I've seen movies all my life. But learning about movies, studying, and did not know, like All the President's Men, one of my favorite movies of all time, is the same director. In fact, I didn't even know the director of All the President's Men, which was sad to say. And then discovering some of his other movies that he did that people alluded to, like Sophie's Choice and Clute, and I start to discover, like, wow, there's so much out there. But anyway, my few quick comments. Dana had mentioned this about the 70s. I'm kind of biased here. I loved this movie for that look, the nostalgia. I grew up in the 70s. The music, the look, as I'm watching this, I'm thinking, yeah, that's what the 70s looked like. That's what TV music, I remember, shows sounded like. So it brought nostalgia to me. It captured it very well, I thought. Again, we talked about the visuals, the cinematography. I don't know, maybe the version I saw on Amazon Prime was redone, but I tell you that those scenes looked sharp. They looked beautiful. They made like ordinary things looked great. These landscape scenes, these pictures, it made it almost like Americana-like. I did find the film at times predictable, but I don't think that's as a negative. What I meant is to say is, like, it would focus on certain things. It would do certain things. You can almost see where it's going. And at times I guessed it correctly, but at times I felt like, I hope I'm wrong. Or when is this going to happen? Like, even in the beginning of the movie, I'm thinking he's going to get shot on the float. I'm thinking that, and he doesn't. I'm like, okay, but he's going to get shot, right? And it's like, so I think that was a very cool way of creating the suspense. My only negative, well, one of my negatives of the movie was, there were some scenes that I thought were a little cheesy, or excessive, like maybe the fight scene or the car crashing in the store. But that being said, it will lead to a question I'll have. I just want one more quick reference of the Enigma you talked about. I kind of agree that I think nowadays many people want to have resolution and explanations to mysteries in film. And I think it's a good thing to have. We need that. But I think at other times, it's good not to have that, to have artistic mechanisms like this that lead to discussions to say, what do you think? I'll give a totally irrelevant example. A movie that just opened up this weekend called I Care a Lot has nothing at all like this. However, it's a movie about very dark characters. There's no redeeming qualities of people in this movie. And that causes divisiveness in people because people want a good guy and a bad guy. They want good to triumph. They don't want to see just all bad people. Anyway, my two questions I had, and one was, tonight there was a lot of references to like other movies saying, hey, this is like that movie, or I've seen this in this movie. I kind of felt like this had a Hitchcockian style, that if Hitchcock were to make a similar movie, there were some elements of it. So I ask you and Lisa, both of you, that is it possible this is actually has a homage to a lot of these other films? As much as I hated that car chase scene and the fight scenes, these are things I've seen in movies before this. You know, all these various sequences in the movie just remind me a bit of movies that came before it. So I wonder if that's a possible thing. My second question is the montage, because we haven't got into too much. As I'm watching it, I'm thinking it's rather lengthy, and it honestly almost seems like out of place. Like all of a sudden in the middle of this movie, they drop this thing, and it lasts a long time. It's kind of like Doris Day breaking into song in that Hitchcock movie. It's just totally different. And I'm thinking, couldn't this have been shorter? Couldn't we just allude to this? But I'm thinking, but it wasn't shorter. He obviously had it intentionally there and for that length, but I don't know why. So if you could answer possibly those questions, I appreciate it. Sorry for the lengthy stuff, but I just wanted to get a few things in. People have said a lot tonight, which is very interesting.
Thanks, William. I'll just say, I really think, like I said to Robert toward the beginning, I think that the things that you see that are homages, or you're asking if are homages, I really think, I would really be shocked if there was any specific reference to any specific movie intended by those. I think that there are certain sorts of elements you see in a movie of this genre, with these types of stories or events. I think there's certain things you see, and you know, I don't think the parade in this movie is a reference to any particular movie any more than the parade in Blowout is a reference to this movie. I think that those are sort of staples of certain types of movies, and if we would have very long lists if we looked at the movies that had these sorts of things. I do think that, you know, I do think elements of some of the depictions of political characters and the places and manners in which they were killed were probably meant to make us think of real things, real people, and real incidents from history, but only probably vaguely, because that would be kind of gruesome.
So in a way, you're saying it's like typical 70s movies had these type of things in them, and that's why we're seeing like
not even necessarily 70s movies, movies of this sort of genre that have any sort of, you know, action, violent, you know, mystery, paranoia chase to them. I mean, I think you just sort of see these things. Yeah, your other questions about the montage I thought were interesting, particularly its length. And before I comment on that, I wanted to give Lisa a chance to talk.
Yeah, the kind of constant with Gordon Willis and Pakula's cinematography is that often shots or sequences are held for much longer than you would expect or even want sometimes. And it's a hallmark. I mean, in a Pakula film, I feel like, especially from this time, you either have very long, uncomfortable shots, or you have these like whip sharp cuts, like when we see Lee in, Beatty's room or Frady's room talking to him. And then the split second later, she's dead in a morgue. Like that is just a brutal cut that really recalls a couple cuts in Klutch at the very beginning when Gruneman is sitting at the table happy with his family, and then there's just this hair fracture of a cut and he's gone. Like Pakula and Willis are really good at the devastatingly quick cut, but then they're also really good at the super long cut or the super long shot that just holds your view to the point of you feeling uncomfortable about it. And I think that really features heavily with the montage sequence. It does go on for a while to the point where you're like, oh, when can I get out of this? Like, when can I get out of this nightmare? And that's the point, is the sequence is doing its work on you, the viewer, just like it's doing its work on Warren Beatty. And you have to kind of consider your own response to it, just like Beatty or Frady has to consider his own response to it and what that means in the larger scale. But yeah, the holding of shots or sequences until you feel uncomfortable about it is kind of a Pakula trademark. Certainly the end in the Raptors when you're just watching the golf cart slam into table after table after table, that could also be an example of a shot that goes on for such length that you feel very uncomfortable about it and you would like to avert your eyes or go on to the next shot. And I think that's very key to Pakula's particular editing style.
When you said the quick edit scene, is that like similar to the one when he's fighting the sheriff in the water? Because I had to rewind that real quick. I thought I missed something. Like he's fighting and all of a sudden it's like this weird edit and it's like he gets hit and I'm like, wait, what happened? It was quick.
It was quick. I don't love that shot. I'm not above saying that this is not a perfect movie. Like I will not say it's a perfect movie. I think that shot is a little maybe shoddily done. I agree. But the shot with Lee to the morgue, that is chef's kiss, perfect cut.
I agree with what Lisa was saying about the reasons why the montage that he sees at Parallax is so long. I should also add, I don't know if everybody saw this in the chat, but I think it was Joss mentioned that if you remember at the beginning of that sequence, they ask him to make sure his fingertips are on the marked spots on the chair and that they were gauging some sort of physiological response from him. And if you can scroll up in the chat for where Joss mentions it, he identifies what it is. I don't know enough about it myself, but that makes sense, and that would render unnecessary any sort of post interview or whatever, and frankly would probably be, it's sort of like a lie detector. Basically it's a physiological gauge of one's reaction to certain stimuli, and you either pass or you don't, I guess. But the other reason that montage has to be so long is because it has to work. It takes time to work through the steps, right? It doesn't automatically, if it went from going through each of those categories the way that, the apple pie 4th of July way you should think about them, and then the like John Wayne Gacy way you should think about them, if it just had those two segments right next to each other, that not only would that not work, but it doesn't even make sense for what they're trying to do. They're trying to gauge this person's place on a spectrum of, I guess, sociopathy or antisocial, behavior or whatever. And so you need to gradually edit the images of the sort of the traditional view and the completely antisocial view of mother, father, country, whatever, God, whatever it is. You need to gradually change those. So this is another sort of situation, I think, in this movie, like I said, with explaining the rationale of the murders. It's either all or nothing. And in this case, they went for all, probably in part because they were really proud of themselves for what they did. But also, I think, I mean, it's primarily, it's for what Lisa said, right? This is the sort of thing where you have to sort of show your work, and it's only going to work on a viewer if they see you showing your editing work too, right? You're not saying this is like this and this is like this, and you need to jump there automatically. You're saying this is like this. Well, maybe it's like this. Well, actually, maybe it's like this, and you're gradually pushing people towards a certain point of view, or seeing where they fall on the spectrum between those 2 points of view. And for that reason, I think it was necessary for it to be so long. Let's see, Vicky, you have a question or comment?
Yes, just unmuted. I just wanted to, I mentioned this in the comments, but I happened to come across, I saw this film in, I think, about 1975, maybe early 1976, in a movie theater. And I happened to come across it because at the time I was living in Poland and read an article, which was a rather thoughtful examination of the film. I just wish I could remember it after all these years in more detail. But it's hard for me to overemphasize the impression the film makes if you actually see it in a darkened theater. I've gotten so used to watching at home that I'd almost forgotten that sort of impact. I'm used to that in, films that you think of as being big pictures or big visuals or whatever. But certainly the whatever we're calling the big montage film, the training or testing or whatever, is powerful. But what I found very, very powerful were the screens of the commissions announcing the fact that there had been no conspiracy and it was a single gunman. It's just chilling. And I think a good deal of that was, in fact, seeing it in the time that it was made after the assassinations of the 60s. There was a certain resonance there, but its power in the cinema is one that you might not necessarily think would be an issue if you've only seen it on video.
Thank you very much for saying that, Vicky. As a longtime and very happy employee of Bryn Mawr Film Institute, I completely agree that the best and ideal and essential way to see movies is in a movie theater. Now, I will take off my that hat, and I will say that you're actually, all kidding aside, you're absolutely right. There are a host of movies. I will say one that people will be surprised by, probably, Casablanca, that if you've only ever seen it at home, you don't understand what the big deal is about it. You don't understand why people are in love with that movie. If you haven't seen it, where your only attention is focused on it and you are surrounded by other people reacting to its highs and lows the way you are. And there are lots of movies like that. And sometimes, Casablanca isn't necessarily a movie you'd think of for that. Black and white, the narrow aspect ratio, the Academy aspect ratio, so on and so forth. But there's a reason that movie-going experience, has the impact that it does. And I appreciate someone else saying it because I feel like I always say it. Lisa, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I loved your comments about the panels, the cyclical, bookend of the government panels, which is just, it's so chilling. It really is. And I love the ultra wide aspect ratio for those scenes in particular. That this is such a wide scoped film in general, but, and I don't know if I can prove this, but it seems like in those bookends, the scene or the lens that they use is somehow even wider. And it's this duality of giving you, all the visual information possible, like getting the widest screen, the most space, you can just see everything, but you see nothing. There's nothing to see. They're speaking in a voyage to an audience-free room, and they're shutting down all inquiry. So it's, again, just a great thematic, resonant use of cinematography to further everything that is meaningful about this movie. So thank you for mentioning those scenes.
Janice, you have a question or comment? Janice, are you there? Okay, I guess we will leave it there then. Thank you all so much for joining us. We have a number of interesting film education opportunities coming up, not the least of which is tomorrow night, being taught by our very own Lisa DeNight. And that rhymed, how about that? Her first of 2 seminars on Fritz Lang. This one will look at his work in Germany, including his German expression, his involvement in the German expressionist movement or cycle. And as you can see from this picture, he worked on M. He also made Metropolis and a number of fascinating movies during this time. Later on, as you can see on screen, she will be doing a second edition talking about Lang's work after he came to Hollywood. In addition, as you can see, we have seminars coming up on short films, on Breaking Bad, and on the Oscars as well. They're going to be different this year, so I'll talk about the history of the awards, but also how they're going to be different this year. And of course, you can find out more about these and our regular discussions and everything else we have going on, our free Ask Andrew mini lessons, our wonderful crossword puzzles and word finds at brynmarfilm.org in the Film Studies online section. Please check that out. And if you want to see some new movies, go over to Theater 5 on brynmarfilm.org, because you can see movies that aren't available through any other streaming source except through the website of movie theaters like ours. There's some really interesting new movies there, so please check those out. We would hope that you would sign up for our emails if you want to find out as soon as possible what we're going to be discussing each Monday. You will get an email on Thursday that identifies the Monday film to be discussed and has a link to the introduction, like the wonderful one that Lisa did for this film that came out last Thursday. You can sign up for all of our emails at brynmarfilm.org. And if you have the means and the inclination, we would greatly appreciate any financial support you can offer. As many of you know, we are open currently for theater rentals. We are bringing in some revenue that way, and we are gearing up to open more broadly, but it's going to be a while longer until we're back fully on our feet. And until then, we would really appreciate any support you can offer. And we look forward to a time when we can all be having these discussions in person. But until then, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next week and for all the discussions coming down the pike. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.